Now this is a story I'm sure many of you may have heard before. It's the story of Suzanne Capper, a young woman who had a hard time making friends and in the end decided to become friends with a group of some of the worst people you could imagine. Now although you may have heard the story, I'm going to be covering it in the same fashion as my other in full detail episodes where I do pretty much just that. Meaning that I'm also going to talk about the more horrific details of the story that many of you may have not heard before because understandably people don't really want to talk about it. Consider that your warning, and let's get on to the video. As I've talked about in some other videos, inflation is doing nothing but getting worse and worse these days. As it gets worse, I know a lot of us are trying to cut back on some expenses here and there. Maybe that's driving less, buying a little bit cheaper food, or being a little bit more selective with video games. We can all agree that it sucks and is less than ideal. Thanks to today's sponsor, Upside, you won't have to cut back anymore. You can use Upside to get cash back on gas, groceries, and even dining out. I found that the Upside app is extremely simple to use. You can immediately see what shops nearby have certain sales going on, and then you can see the amount of money that you'll get back. Just select gas, groceries, or restaurants and get a quick view of what you'll end up paying in the end. Nifty. With the money I save, I plan on going back to buying food that's actually good and isn't just sustenance. Now that I get money back here and there, it adds back up to where I'm spending about the amount that I used to. Maybe I'm even spending more smart than before now that I've got it all laid out for me. To get started, simply download the Upside app for free in Google Play or on the App Store. Use my promo code DIRETRIP, all caps, and get an extra $5 or more back on your first purchase of $10 or more. Once you've got it, just check in at whatever business you go to, pay as usual with your credit or debit card, and get paid. Simple. In comparison to typical credit card reward systems, you'll get 3 times more cash back here. Then simply send it to your bank account, your PayPal, or get an e-gift card for something like Amazon. Perfect for when Christmas is coming up. Users of Upside are earning more than $1 million cash back every week. That's probably why the rating is so high on the App Store. Once again, simply download the Upside app for free in Google Play or on the App Store. Then use my code DIRETRIP to get an extra $5 or more back on your first purchase of $10 or more. Suzanne Capper was a quiet girl who, throughout most of her life, didn't really have many friends. If she met anyone she felt she connected with, she desperately tried to cling to them, no matter how horribly they came to treat her. Obviously, this was not a good way to go about maintaining a social life, and she had to find that out the hard way. Suzanne had been described by those who knew her as a gentle and easily influenced girl from the beginning. Her own mother described her as being very forgiving, to a fault, you might say. She was often babysat by a woman she knew named Jean Powell since she was about 10 years old. Growing up, she never knew her biological father. Instead, she and her sister were raised by their stepfather, John Capper, along with their mother, Elizabeth Dunbar. Unfortunately, the two would go on to get divorced when she was about 14 years old. This was something the family never truly recovered from. By the time she was 16 years old, she was growing up in Greater Manchester, England. It's like regular Manchester, but much greater. For a while, she lived with local authorities after the divorce. But in the end, she, along with her older sister Michelle, decided to live with their stepfather after the split. After a while, she started skipping school more and more, even couch surfing from time to time, just attempting to kind of make a connection with anyone she could. Despite all these issues, though, she was described as being happy, high-spirited, and well-mannered. She would help anyone out with any chores they needed done and was overall very polite and kind to anyone she came in contact with. After a while, she regularly alternated between staying with her mom, her stepdad, family friends, or the local authorities. This period of instability wasn't really having a positive impact on her life in general, as she started to fall behind in basically all areas. Eventually, she ended up at the home of her old babysitter, Jean Powell, now 26, after getting friendly with her brother, a man named Clifford. Suzanne ended up dating him for a while. Jean was a good 10 years older than Suzanne, already providing for an odd dynamic, but she was also living with 3 children in an old, dilapidated house. However, it wasn't very far from Suzanne's stepfather's home, so nobody really thought too much of it. Nevertheless, it wasn't good for her. Suzanne would often spend the night there, skip school the next morning, and babysit all of her kids for free throughout the day. It wasn't too long before Suzanne was spending more time with Jean and her circle of friends than her own family, or anyone, really. Her family didn't think much of this, however, not knowing how awful things truly were behind the scenes. A good chunk of people were living at Jean Powell's house by this time. In addition to her 3 children, Jeffrey Lee, a 26-year-old former prison inmate, was there very often as well, often hoping to score some drugs. He had been locked away previously for burglary, theft, and drunken disorderly charges. Jean's ex-husband, Glenn, remained friendly and came over often. Clifford, Jean's brother, was still living there as well. Now, it goes without saying that this whole group, this group of people that Suzanne considered to be her closer friends, were very avid drug users. This old, run-down house was a known local hotspot when it came to doing drugs, selling drugs, receiving and selling stolen property, parties, and one-night stands. Stolen cars were traded for cash, illicit substances were weighed out in the open on kitchen scales, and people were getting it on pretty much everywhere. After a while, none of this could be realistically hidden. I tried to stop Suzanne from going there, but she had a very strong will, said her stepfather, John. However, despite not wanting her to go over there, John didn't really know the full extent of what was going on. He knew it was something, but he couldn't have imagined how much of that something was happening. All he knew was that he had a suspecting feeling that Jean and her friends were all evil. We found out that Jean had taken Suzanne out of school and was making her work as a cleaner at the CIS building in town, said her mother later on. She was taking her money, only letting her keep £5 a week while we thought she was in school. When we confronted her about it, she actually threatened to burn our house down. Things only got even worse when yet one more person moved into the home, a woman named Bernadette McNeely. Bernadette, a 24-year-old neighbor, was basically living there full-time along with Anthony Dudson, a 17-year-old she was sleeping with. She had 3 children of her own as well, who all moved in alongside her. Suzanne's older sister Michelle was actually living there alongside her in Jean's house, but moved out because she didn't like the, quote, evil new friends that Jean was hanging around with, namely Bernadette, who she found to be the most evil, sadistic, and shady of the group, to say the least. Despite being bullied and disrespected by basically everyone in that house, Suzanne kept staying there. They all took advantage of her kindness to get favors out of her the whole time. It was not that she was scared of them, it's just that she would do anything for them. She pampered their every whim, said her sister Michelle. In late 1992, Suzanne retreated back to her mom's house after Jean had beaten her up. However, her mom turned her away at the door. Her boyfriend didn't want her to stay over, and she wasn't about to go against her new lover. Suzanne begged her, but ended up having to walk all the way back to Jean's house that night. If her mother would have let her in that night, all might have ended there and then. Unfortunately, it didn't. Things started going downhill more and more quickly from then onward. In late November, Suzanne and Jean met up with Mohammed Yusuf, who they knew as a friend of a friend in Sale. Suzanne encouraged Jean to hook up with Yusuf, a man with a real sheikh-type get-up, to which she adamantly refused. Actually, she was offended. She berated Suzanne for, what she says, trying to make me go with an Arab. Yusuf himself denied that this has happened, but he likely just wasn't around when they had that particular conversation. This was the first of many squabbles that would lead to the end. Their relationship continued to sour from this point onwards. It was sometime after this point that Jean tied Suzanne up and held her as a prisoner for 4 days straight. Unfortunately, nobody that Suzanne told about this actually believed her. After this, Jean claimed that Suzanne tried to convince her to sleep with a man for money. Then it was said that Suzanne took a pink coat from her. Again after that, the group suspected that they had all contracted lice, downstairs lice, from a bed that Suzanne had been using. Anthony, though, had a different theory. He had been sleeping with Suzanne, but also with Jean and Bernadette as well. He figured that he must have gotten it from Suzanne and spread it to the rest of them. Whether or not any of these assertions were even true, the group treated them as such, and their contempt and distrust of Suzanne continued to grow. Eventually, this contempt turned to outright hostility, which led to mistreatment and even beatings of Suzanne that continued on and on. Reading the room, to put it lightly, Suzanne went back to her stepfather's home. One day, December 7th of 1992, Jean and her friends went over to the home in order to try to lure her back to Jean's place. They arrived with the story that a boy she liked was there, looking for her, wanting to hang out with her. In reality, Glenn and Anthony were the only 2 men who were waiting there for her. Unfortunately, Suzanne went back to the home with them. They grabbed her as she entered the front door and held her down. First, they wanted revenge for having to shave all of their junk after the lice episode. They shaved her hair and her eyebrows and made her clean up all the hair herself and place it into a trash can. They then put a plastic bag over her head, tightened it, and walked around her in circles while beating her over the head with all manner of household objects, like giant ornamental wooden spoons. Suzanne fell to the floor and curled up in a ball. This was when Jean and Bernadette took turns beating her with the 3-foot-long wooden board and a belt. They then took her to the bathroom and forced her to shave her own junk as well as a form of revenge. They then went back to hitting her with belts, the spoons, and other objects. This was so severe that one of her arms would be rendered completely useless and simply hung down to her side from then on out. That night, they locked her up in a cupboard and kept her there overnight. The next morning, they let her out only to take her upstairs and lock her in a different cupboard. Suzanne started screaming and crying out for help. After a while, Jean and Bernadette started to fear that someone would hear her, and the screams were starting to disturb their kids. So they took her and moved her out into Bernadette's currently abandoned home a few doors down. Here they propped up an old bed and shackled Suzanne to it, arms and legs spread apart, with chains, ropes, electrical tape, and belts. They put dirty socks into her mouth to muffle her screaming and left her hanging there for the time being. That is, until Bernadette started shooting up and got high out of her mind. She started calling herself Chucky after the famous horror movie doll. Clifford and Jeffrey started coming over to this old house as well, more than willing to partake in the torture. Said torture would go on for 5 grueling, agonizing days, non-stop. This was when Suzanne suffered some of the worst treatment anyone could imagine. She was injected with amphetamines against her will over and over again. She was burned all over her face and body with cigarettes. She was unable to move, and they refused to unhook her to even let her use the bathroom. As a result, she was soon lying in a bed of her own excrement. Eventually, the scent became unbearable, and the gang let her down only to force her into a bathtub full of disinfectant. They scrubbed her with a yard brush, scraping these chemicals into her until her skin started peeling off. They locked her back up on the bed, and the mistreatment only got worse from there. Each time the torture would commence, Bernadette would begin by stating, "Chucky's coming to play." Suzanne was beaten repeatedly, day in and day out with all manner of objects. They placed headphones on her, forcing her to listen to a song featuring Chucky's "I'm Chucky, You Wanna Play" line on repeat, over and over again at maximum volume as they forcefully injected her with more drugs. She spent the rest of these days lying on the beat-up old bed, back covered in blisters, skin still ripped to shreds from the chemical bath, searing in pain, with dirty socks stuffed into her mouth, barely even able to breathe. The pain from a deep cigarette burn right between her eyes only further increased the agony she was forced to endure. Another associate of the gang, David Hill, an 18-year-old, was brought over to the house. He heard screaming from the back room. When he asked what was going on, Jeffrey brought him in to see Suzanne. He could clearly see the horror of what was going on, but he chose not to free her. She begged him for help, but he said he couldn't. He asked who she was, and she told him her name. She asked to be untied, but he said he couldn't do anything. He was too afraid of Jeffrey to possibly go against him, fearing he'd face the same treatment himself, giving in to his fear and shock in the end and simply leaving her there. While all of this was happening, a few men from the group even went and helped Suzanne's sister's fiancé repair his car, never giving any indication of what was going on, treating them as normal. Behind the scenes, though, at this point, the gang had made up their mind. She wasn't getting out of this alive. They were going to finish the job. They decided that they would need to make identification of the body more difficult. In order to do so, they were going to remove her teeth, while she was still alive. This was when Clifford took out a pair of pliers, telling her, "Right, I'm going to rip your teeth out." He tore out her 2 front teeth, which he later took home as a trophy. Getting lazy with the rest of the job, he simply started trying to mash out the rest of her teeth with the pliers. When this didn't work, he started pulling on them again, yanking until her entire head was pulled toward him, only to snap back as he pulled out pieces. Many of the teeth only snapped and chipped off. So he continued hitting them again, breaking them until nerve endings were left exposed, laughing all the way. Once the 6 attackers heard that Suzanne's family was about to report her missing, they decided that now was as good a time of any to get things over with. December 14th, 1992, the early hours of the morning. The whole gang unchained Suzanne from her bed, dragged her outside, and threw her into one of their stolen cars, a white Fiat that would become associated with the case. Jean, Glenn, Bernadette, and Anthony drove off with her, with Bernadette giggling all the way. They drove 15 miles out to a narrow road at Warneth Low, near Romley, which was on the outskirts of Stockport. In this remote woodland, they forced Suzanne out of the car and threw her down into an embankment. Thorns tore into her skin as she rolled down through the leaves and bushes, slicing up her bare feet. Bernadette pulled out a gas can, walked over to Suzanne, and poured gasoline all over her. Suzanne looked back in horror as Bernadette attempted to light her on fire. She failed in her first attempt, which caused Glenn and Anthony to attempt it themselves as well. Suzanne, injured and malnourished and horrified, could do nothing but watch as they again and again failed to burn her alive. After enough tries, though, they got it to light. Jean later stated, "She went straight up in flames and was screaming." This was when Bernadette started to sing "Burn Baby Burn," lyrics from Disco Inferno, as Suzanne burned alive right in front of her eyes. Satisfied, believing Suzanne was dead and gone, the group decided to call it a day and head back to Jean's house. They stopped and picked up some drinks along the way home to celebrate. Once they got back, Clifford and Jeffrey were there waiting to hear how it all went. Little did they know, Suzanne had survived the attack. She had suffered burns across 80% of her entire body, but she was still alive. Her skin was peeling off, her feet were charred black, and her legs were said to have looked like raw meat. Despite all of this, she managed to crawl back up and scramble back into the embankment up to the road. She stood on her badly burned and chopped up feet and managed to walk about 400 meters up to Compstall Road. A man named Barry Sutcliffe and two of his colleagues were driving down that road on their way to work at around 6:10 a.m. when they came across Suzanne on the road. One can only imagine their fear and confusion as they came across the severely burned woman shambling down the street. They picked her up and immediately rushed to a nearby house, pounded on the front door, urging the residents to call an ambulance. Barry knew what must have happened to Suzanne before he even asked. It was very obvious that she had been burned severely. One of the residents in the home, Michael Coop, said, "Both her hands appeared like ash. Her legs were just like raw meat, and her feet appeared to be badly charred. I was struck by how polite the victim was. She was constantly thanking my wife for her assistance." His wife, Margaret, said, "I instinctively went to put my arms around her, but she pulled away because she could not bear to be touched. Her head was shaved, and there were recent, not new, cuts to her head. Her face was almost featureless. Her hands were red raw and black at the fingertips. Her legs were red from top to bottom. She couldn't bear anything near her legs." Suzanne went on to chug 6 full glasses of water. She needed assistance, though. Due to the extensive injuries on her hands, she wasn't able to hold the glasses herself. The ambulance came and Suzanne was rushed to Withington Hospital. Once there, she was able to name all 6 of her attackers, even telling the authorities their address. She then slipped into a coma. Her injuries were so extensive that her mother and father didn't recognize her. She was only able to be positively identified by a partial fingerprint from one of her less damaged thumbs, one of the only parts of her hands that wasn't thoroughly burned. An inquiry was made into her death by Detective Inspector Peter Wall of the Greater Manchester Police. At 7:30 that same evening, he ordered officers to storm the house at 97 Langworthy Road and arrest anyone they found there. Once the police arrived, they came across a home that could only be described as an absolute disaster. The living room was absolutely littered with trash, and car seats removed from stolen cars were being used in place of furniture. They stumbled across the trash can full of Suzanne's hair. Then, on a shelf next to a ramshackle Christmas tree was a pair of pliers, covered in blood alongside a number of teeth. In the beginning, all of the 6 denied any sort of involvement in the case altogether. Jean and Bernadette actually giggled and joked with each other as the police were cuffing them. However, one person would go on to talk, Anthony Dudson. His father begged him to tell the truth, and he did. As all of the details of the case started coming to light, the detective said, "As the story began to unfold, we just couldn't believe it. I kept asking myself how one human being could do this to another." He added that the police, quote, "wept as the extent of Suzanne's suffering was revealed." Police and hospital staff began to gather donations in order to buy some flowers to send to her in the hospital. Dr. William Lauer, a home office pathologist, said, "It was clear from the outset that Suzanne was unlikely to survive. She suffered superficial but widespread burns that led to several complications internally. There was a partial collapse in one of her lungs. Unfortunately, the doctors were correct, as Suzanne passed away shortly after. She never woke up from her coma, passing away on the 18th of December in 1992, passing away due to multiple organ failure due to the severe burns. A few days later, all 6 of the assailants appeared before magistrates in Manchester as they remained in custody. All were charged with kidnapping and attempted murder initially, but following Suzanne's death, the charges were upped to full-on murder charges. The pathologist from the hospital came to testify that Suzanne had suffered burns from 75 to 80% of her entire body, confirming that her case was consistent with having gasoline thrown on her and set alight, adding that anyone's chances of survival would be minimum in those circumstances. The coroner also spoke up, saying, "It is clear that this young girl must have suffered a great deal of pain and had no chance of survival. But she did fortunately survive long enough to give information which led to the people being mentioned being charged with her death." He then gave a statement directed at both Suzanne's mother and her stepfather, saying, "I offer you, not just on my behalf, but on behalf of the whole nation, my very deepest sympathy and condolences at this tragic happening to your young daughter." The trial itself finally started on the 16th of November, 1993, going on to last for 22 days. All 6 of the criminals denied their involvement, doing their best to minimize their role and blame others, all turning on each other in the end. None of them were willing to take credit for the final act of burning Suzanne alive. Jean Powell painted herself as a timid, scared girl who was simply along for the ride in the car. She said that she remained in the car while the others burned her, saying, "I was numb. I was scared." Further attempting in vain to describe herself as a good person, she said that she only locked Suzanne in a cupboard for her own safety, saying that she loved her as a sister, and that she couldn't stand violence, adding that she was unable to even smack her own children if they misbehaved. Bernadette admitted that she indeed held the gas can, but stated that Anthony had actually grabbed it from her just before Suzanne caught fire. She said that she had only injected Suzanne with amphetamines in order to protect her from being injected with heroin. Alright, I'll admit, I have no idea what she's trying to say here. Is there any basis in reality to that statement? Is that a thing? I'm kind of calling bullshit right now, but let me know in the comments. Anthony further played hot potato with the blame, passing it on to Glenn, saying that he was the one who actually set the fire. Clifford was cleared of murder charges as he was at the home, but he wasn't getting away scot-free. The jury was forced to go ahead and begin deliberations with this information on the 16th of December. It only took them 9 hours and 52 minutes to come to a conclusion. Clifford Pook was sentenced for pleading guilty to conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, which got him 15 years, and pleading guilty to false imprisonment, which also got him 15 years. Jeffrey Lee was also acquitted of the murder, but eventually pleaded guilty to false imprisonment as well, getting him 12 years. That brings us to the people present at the time of the murder, starting with Glenn Powell, who was guilty of murder, which got him life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years, guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, which was 20 years, and then guilty of false imprisonment, another 20 years. Then we have Anthony Michael Dudson, who was guilty of murder, detained indefinitely with a minimum tariff of 18 years, guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, again 15 years. Guilty of murder, detained indefinitely with a minimum tariff of 18 years. Guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, 15 years. And he pleaded guilty to false imprisonment, getting him another 15 years. Then we have Suzanne's quote-unquote best friend, Jean Powell, who was guilty of murder, which got her life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, 20 years. And she pleaded guilty to false imprisonment, getting another 20 years. And finally, we have Chucky herself, Bernadette McNeely, who ended up guilty of murder, getting life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, 20 years. And she pleaded guilty to false imprisonment as well, getting another 20 years. During the sentencing, the judge, Francis Potts, expressed his disgust with the case. He said to the criminals, "Each of you has been convicted on clear evidence of murder, which was as appalling a murder as it is possible to imagine." Some of the jurors themselves were crying as the gallery rejoiced, with members of the public, relatives of the victim herself, screaming yes as the criminals received their sentences. The detective on the case, D.I. Wall, said in a statement to the press, "Psychological reports say that these were absolutely sane individuals. It's frightening that they are such ordinary people. There is nothing special about any of them." Jeffrey Lee went on to appeal his sentence and actually succeeded, reducing his prison term from 12 years down to 9 years. Anthony Dudson's minimum tariff was cut as well, going from 18 years down to 16 years. He appealed again, arguing that this reduction wasn't good enough. Justices dismissed this second appeal, though. In 1996, while she was in the HM Prison Durham, Bernadette had some dirty laundry unearthed. During a routine security check, letters were found detailing her affair with the prison governor, Mike Martin. The officer himself was actually married at the time. He resigned before any action could be taken against him. Bernadette was then transferred to HM Prison Newhall. Jeffrey Lee was freed very early on in his sentence in 1998. Clifford Pook himself was released in 2001. Both are free to this day. Both Gene Powell and Bernadette McNeely were allowed to have the lengths of their minimum sentences reviewed by the Court of Appeal in June of 2012, where Bernadette actually succeeded in reducing her minimum sentence by 1 year. Anthony Dudson was moved into an open prison in 2009, but he was eventually released as well in 2013. In 2015, Bernadette McNeely was paroled, released from prison after being described as a model prisoner who was said to have been filled with remorse. She changed her name to Bernie Gardner and was eventually found by citizens outraged by her release. Some of them approached her new workplace, where a staff member told them, "She served her sentence. What's it got to do with you?" She remains free to this day. It seems that Gene Powell is the only member of the group still in prison. Once again, thank you for watching my video. I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed the story, but if you found it interesting, please give it a like. It really helps me out in the algorithm, and if you like content like this, feel free to subscribe. If you don't mind, go ahead and follow me on social media, because you know how YouTube is with channels like this. If anything were to ever happen to me, that would probably be the only place you'd ever hear about it. If you want to support the channel even further, I do have a Patreon account, which I keep linked down in the description below, and speaking of which, shout out to the top patrons. We've got El Palmieri, Pao Yang, Alice Malice Tentacles, April Diamond, Starfade, Astral, Grack, Angie, Rick of Work in Progress USA, Sash Johnson, Marianne McCurdy, Buttery Frankus, Wafrans, Jules Latona, Arctic Cat, Alan Damiani, Marsh, Rinsenstein, Kim Peak, Lux Alpaca, Charity, Scoochie Main, Jackie, and Mark Barnett. Let's all jump, because we're cool. This has been your host, Kyle. Thank you, and good night.